Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, we're so excited to have Christian Howell, the Chief Commercial Officer of Cognito Therapeutics, joining us on the show. We're going to be hitting on a couple of major topics, including value-based healthcare, evidence-driven strategies for organizations, and really a little bit of his background and how he learned from his military experience and brought it to life sciences. So, Christian, thank you so much for joining the show today. Really excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Kim, for having me. Excited to talk to you.
Of course. To start us off, I'd love to start on that last topic. So you have an incredibly interesting background, very unique to the life sciences industry. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the major steps you've taken along the way, and in particular about your military experience?
Yeah, so my career sort of had three chapters to it. So upon graduating college, I was commissioned as an officer in the United States Navy and went into the service. Spent time forward deployed, had one of the more unique experiences of being overseas during September 11th. We were actually doing some work in the Persian Gulf at the time. At the end of my military experience, I was recruited out into medical devices. It actually is a pretty common model for some of the medical device companies to look for junior military officers, that they are, type A, driven, motivated, not a bad place to put some folks into sales. So that got me into doing some work with Covidien and then ultimately Medtronic. And that was an amazing experience. It was, and we could talk a little bit about that, but spent about 15 years with Medtronic. And my last role there was leading the value-based healthcare sort of partnership work that they were doing, which was amazing. It gave me an opportunity, one, to meet with a really wide array of health systems and payers around the United States and in Canada. But it also gave me the opportunity to learn sort of firsthand from Omar Ishrak and Jeff Martha, who are the former CEO and CEO of Medtronic, which was amazing. But really what that experience taught me was to make better decisions in healthcare about what's appropriate for, the right patient at the right time in their care, was that data and evidence was everything, that you really couldn't do value-based healthcare unless you had really robust data coming from the medical device company and robust data coming from the health system. And then you could kind of match and marry those. And so I was really looking for an opportunity to see and find organizations that were trying to solve that riddle in a lot of ways. And spoke to a couple of people in the industry, one of which is, sort of a luminary and gave me great guidance, which was Josh Makower at Stanford Biodesign. And he, at the time, was working with NEA and said, have you heard about Aetion and the work that they're doing with real world evidence, which Aetion is an amazing company that was out of the School of Public Health at Harvard and was developing this really robust real world evidence that life science companies could use across the product life cycle. So I went over there and I became the general manager of their medical device and diagnostic business. I ultimately had an opportunity to take responsibility for the payer and the government business, which was amazing because I think the FDA is doing kind of tremendous work around real world evidence. And then ultimately found myself sort of missing medtech. I felt like I was sort of one step removed from the patient. And so one of our clients was Cognito. I thought the work that they were doing was just spectacular. I mean, this idea of addressing Alzheimer's disease through physics rather than through chemistry and using a medical device was really compelling. And then a gentleman by the name of Rick Kuntz, who was the chief scientific and medical officer at Medtronic, and in the medical device world is sort of incredibly well regarded, joined the board at Cognito, and that was kind of all I needed. I was like, okay, I'm going to lean in. So I've been there since October, and it's been an amazing experience. It feels very sort of pioneering and kind of cutting edge, which is really exciting.
That's an amazing background. I'd love to jump into a few different topics that you just brought up there. Going back to some of the earlier points. In your time at Medtronic, it sounds like you were working on value-based healthcare before it was cool for the industry to be doing so. Can you talk a little bit about some of those early experiences, what value-based healthcare meant when you started working on it versus your current experiences and how it's really playing out in practice?
Yeah, it was an amazing, I really give Omar a great deal of credit. I think his vision toward value-based healthcare and what he was trying to do with Medtronic both incredibly sophisticated and very smart. And so what his mission was can we take a company that's got $30 billion in revenue driven through volume and transition it to revenue driven through value. And what that meant was we had to become much more closely aligned to health systems and payers. We had to really understand our own data and think about appropriateness. So, which patient cohort really is most and best impacted by our technologies? How do we find them in the data? How do we work with the health system to ensure that when that patient presents itself in its care pathway, that the technology is aligned to them? And then ultimately, how do you create a sort of commercial model or business model that matches it? The thing I think that was really the thing that was sort of most inspiring and sort of eye-opening to me was, Omar used to say that, value-based healthcare is massively impactful to med tech companies because it changes the decisions from ones that are subjective to much more objective. And I got to tell you, when I came out of the military, this was my biggest aha moment was I couldn't believe how sort of decisions were being made. Like, I'm going to use this device because I like Christian or I like Kim or I get a good rebate. And I was just like, boy, it doesn't feel evidence driven. It doesn't feel patient centric to me.
Right.
And value-based healthcare sort of puts value in the patient right in the middle of the equation. And what Omar used to say when health systems would sort of challenge us and say, well, why are you doing this? Is this, what if I don't pick Medtronic? What if we look at the data and we determine that one of your competitors has a better technology? And the response I thought was sort of so intellectually honest, which was either way, that's good for us. So if we win, that sort of reaffirms that from a outcomes perspective or a cost perspective, we're aligned to what our customers want. If you choose a competitor because they deliver better outcomes, well, then that gives me real concrete feedback to take to my R&D and product development groups to say, okay, we need to rethink the outcomes that we're driving. If we lose on cost, then that gives me real feedback to take to my business units and say, hey, look, we need to think about new commercial models. We need to think about new value propositions. And so, but if the decision is made to go to a competitor because I like the rep or I get this rebate, Medtronic or any company is kind of just lost. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to change. And so I sort of loved that idea that it became that the selection process, the value analysis became much more objective rather than subjective. And to me, I think it'll reduce variation. It'll improve quality. It'll really be amazingly impactful for the med tech and for all of life sciences. I just think we need to sort of develop the tools and the skills necessary to do it.
One thing that makes me think about is a point that you've brought up in prior conversations that you and I have been able to have, which has really been that there's a little bit of a red thread throughout your career that is very evidence driven and all of the things you've done in terms of your military career, making sure that there's objective decision making in the work that you're doing, what you are working on at Medtronic, what you're building at Cognito. Can you talk a little bit more about what being evidence driven means to you as a leader, regardless of the roles that you're actively playing? But it sounds like these are all, very common themes.
Yeah, I love that phrase, and I'm going to not know the scientist who said it, which is, in God we trust, everyone else bring data, right? So I think about that all the time, which is, and I've loved this sort of, I think that there's been this really sort of maturation or evolution in healthcare, which is, I do think 30 years ago, there were far too many decisions made not that weren't evidence driven. And then I think as health systems became much more savvy, and I think as they recognized that there was the ability to do really robust evidence development, then they were demanding of clinical evidence. And I think that's where you heard of like evidence-based selling, right? This idea that we're going to bring in robust randomized clinical trials or evidence that are going to demonstrate. And then what happened was health systems and payers became much more data rich, right? The EHR became much more prominent. And now it was, well, okay, I appreciate that you're bringing me your evidence, but the fact that you did the study on, 100 bike riding Norwegians doesn't really reflect my population here in Pittsburgh or Cleveland, right? So, but what I can do is I can look at my data and I can give you a much more representative population to look at. And so that's where I think you went from evidence-based selling to real-world evidence-based selling or commercialization. And I think, to me, what's great about that is you're right. It creates a thread that I think commercial officers or scientific officers or chief executive officers can be thinking about, which is evidence is going to be critical across my entire product lifecycle. I'm going to have evidence in the pre-market to answer the questions of regulators and scientists in the clinical community. I'm going to have evidence in the post-market to answer questions of payers and clinicians and patients. And so what we should do is be really thoughtful about our evidence strategy. And that probably does harken back to the military a little bit, which is, all right, let's try to be as sort of thoughtful and comprehensive about the task at hand. Let's try to understand what are the near term kind of needs and desired outcomes, but let's also understand a little bit more long term what we're trying to do and what we're trying to impact. And the thing I will just tell you, the thing I take as just a bit of an aside, the thing I take that of all these organizations that I've been a part of, and it would be the advice I would give to any new startup, is how critical a clear mission is to what you're trying to do, right? So in the military, in the United States Navy, it's a very clear mission, right? Support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Medtronic had an unbelievably clear message, right? With biomedical engineering company, restore life, restore health, extend life. And then there, at ATN, I saw the same thing. And what it did was it not only served as inspiration, I think, for the service members or the employees. And I'm a big believer that inspiration leads to innovation, but it also, if the mission is constructed in a way that is thoughtful and forward thinking, then it provides real strategic direction to organizations. And, I'll never forget, there was a time when Omar was stepping down and Jeff was coming in, and I said to Omar, what advice are you going to give Jeff? And I thought I was going to get this like really robust piece of advice about shareholders. Right? And he said to me, Christian, it's really easy. It's fidelity to the mission. That Earl Bakken, when he started Medtronic, gave really clear guidance to the organization about who we are and what we are. And I think about that all the time, right? Like we want to inspire employees, and we want to think about ways of keeping everyone to do a little bit more and push a little bit harder. And I think you can do that by having a really clear mission on what you're trying to achieve. But I also think if you're thoughtful, that mission can be guiding in a strategic perspective. And I didn't really appreciate that, I think, until I had been in a couple environments where I got past just the inspiration of it, and I got to see like, wow, this is really these are guiding strategic principles. Right. And so like one for me is always going to be this idea about evidence, about being patient first. These sort of common themes that you sort of see in my career, like they inform is it, if I were to build a mission, or as I were to, think about my own personal mission and what I'm doing. I mean, I think it's really, there they are, those sort of common threads.
Incredible. So based off that, I'd love to shift gears a little bit to what you're building at Cognito now. And maybe we can take a step back and you can talk about what Cognito is and what your promise is. And to your point, what the clear mission is of Cognito and trying to bring to market. What I'd really love to better understand is how you've pulled this red thread of evidence through to your role and your evidence plan at Cognito.
Yeah. So, Cognito is doing some remarkable stuff. So first of all, let's just talk about the disease in which we're trying to address, which is I candidly did not appreciate how I'd heard stories of Alzheimer's disease, and I had friends and family members that had been impacted by it, but I don't think I realized how pervasive it is. It's certainly, just talking about the United States to start, there's about 6.5 million people in the United States with Alzheimer's disease. So 1 in 3 people are going to die with Alzheimer's. Which makes what matters even worse is that there's also about 10 million people in the United States that have what is called mild cognitive impairment, which are, many of those are going to progress onto Alzheimer's. Of those 10 million, about 8 million are undiagnosed. So not only do we have this enormous issue with patients that are suffering from this disease. And one of the things I've sort of always thought about is that this is a +1 disease. It doesn't just impact the patient; it impacts the family and the caregivers. And so there's not only been a challenge in how we're going to treat these patients with Alzheimer's, but there's been a real challenge with how we're going to diagnose and find these patients. So what I've been really amazed by, just as I've come into this, is the community around Alzheimer's, right? That I think that there's a healthy competitive environment, right? I think that you're seeing monoclonal antibodies coming to the market, and you're seeing neurotech coming to the market, and you're seeing ways of using ultrasound to deliver therapies more effectively. But I think what's really amazing to me is that everyone has sort of recognized that this mountain ahead of us, and these, we all know about how the aging population, that there is this real sort of community about like, okay, great, as many solutions as possible, because we've been without one. There has not been a disease modifying therapy. What I love about what Cognito is trying to achieve is there is a real opportunity to use physics and to use a medical device to treat these patients, because oftentimes drug therapy can be very difficult to utilize in diseases of neurodegenerative diseases. The blood-brain barrier is a real challenge, and oftentimes using neurostimulation of the central nervous system to access and drive change is a much more effective on-ramp. The idea that you can deliver a therapy at home, the idea that therapy can be incredibly safe, the idea that therapy can be non-invasive. So Cognito was developed out of the labs of MIT, and the way that the technology works is it's a non-invasive, safe, at-home sort of targeted neuromodulation that what we've learned is that if you can get the neurons of the brain to oscillate at a particular frequency, which the range that we're talking about is what's called gamma, then that keys the brain to say, "Oh, I'm active. I'm operating at a different level than I've operated in the past. And what I need to do is I need to express certain genes and proteins to permit or enable that type of engagement." And those genes and proteins are incredibly important to improving cognitive function or slowing cognitive decline, improving function or slowing function, and improving brain health. And so it was just amazing to me to think, okay, here's an opportunity to go into this space that is in desperate need of a solution, that so many of these patients want the ability to proactively address this disease at home and in a safe way. And that I could sort of lead the way that we bring this to market. So we've received a breakthrough designation from the FDA. We're through our pilot study. We're in the middle of our pivotal study. Fingers crossed, all hoping goes well, that in the next couple of years we'll go in front of the FDA, and then ultimately the technology will be brought to the market and be able to impact millions of patients' lives is the goal.
Incredible. And I love where you started the conversation about Cognito, which is how big and pervasive of a problem it is. For anybody that watches the general news in the United States, we're seeing FDA announcement after announcement regarding drugs coming to market for Alzheimer's. It is a highly visible disease state when it comes to drug development. There's a lot of questions about the evidence and the data that's been brought forward for the drugs that have been approved and that are current options for patients, which aren't fantastic options, but they're better than nothing, for lack of a better way of describing it. And so when we think about that, and I think about your role in particular, and the future plan to bring this to market and have to convince physicians and patients to really use a device instead of a drug, you really have an uphill battle. This is something that has always been considered a druggable target, for lack of a better way of describing it, and that's what the common discourse is focused on. So, can you talk to us a little bit about what does it mean to bring an entire new modality to a disease state that is so widely discussed and so in the public eye? How are you thinking about that and the uphill battle ahead of you?
Yeah, it's super interesting, right? Like, I mean, it's if it was easy, anybody would do it kind of thing. But for me, it's, so going back to that sort of, it takes a village piece, right? And I'll talk a little bit about how I'm thinking about, because I want to learn from those that have come before me, which is, how do you bring a novel technology to market, but not make it a novelty, right? So how does it seem unique, and how does it seem progressive and potentially wildly impactful, but not, how do you overcome the naysayers? And to come back to this common thread, I think the way that you do that is through evidence, right? And I think that you have to think about, I think you have to think about who are your stakeholders that you're going to be looking to inform or to educate, right? And I talk about the 6 stakeholders that we have, whether it's the scientific community, the clinical community, the regulatory community, the payer community, the patient community, caregivers, right? So I think, one, you have to think about, okay, how do I communicate the value proposition, and what is the right value proposition to share? For some of those stakeholders, it might be safety. For them, those might be efficacy. For them, it might be cost effectiveness. So I think you have to be really sort of looking at it through the lens of your key contingent, your constituency. And so for me, it's patients first, right? So what are the things that are most important to patients? And then it's caregivers and physicians, and down the line. The one thing, the piece of advice I might give, or just a perspective I will just coming into this role, which is, I think that there is, we are trying to do this sort of enormous thing. And to believe that we're going to be able to do it within just the 4 walls of Cognito would be a fool's errand, right? We need to think about partnerships. We need to think about learning from others, And so to me, this is where I would really encourage early stage or is to explore all of the resources available to you. And I'll give you just sort of one that comes to mind, which is the FDA, right? And specifically for me in MedTech, CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. I think in many companies, there's this sort of perspective of, we only talk to the FDA when we need to, that we're sort of guarded and resistant, and we don't want to be too transparent, right? That there's this sort of, and I get it, and I understand this sort of the risks in the past, but I think Jeff Shuren, who's the director of CDRH, has done this incredible job of saying, and I think it's been informed by people like Josh Maurer and others have sort of said, like, look, there's real challenges to bringing devices to market. There's real challenges in reimbursement of devices. And so what they've done is they tried to create an array of programs that help early stage companies. So things like Breakthrough, or we participate in a program called the EPFP, which is the Early Payer Feedback Program through the FDA, sharing what our technology is, getting connected to payers, so we can talk to them about, like, what are the key value propositions that should resonate? What do we need within our evidence portfolio to answer the questions that you might have that we don't have now, right? So I just think, I participated in a program supported by the FDA called NEST, which was ways of using real world evidence for regulatory finding. And it was a collaborative community where medtech companies and regulators and science and data providers could all come together and answer questions in sort of an open-handed way, right? The way you would teach your children to play a card game. Like, let's put our cards on the table and let's show what we're trying. And to me, I just think, again, I think if any organization is mission-driven, patient-centric, I think you can go to these organizations and you can go to these programs and say, I don't expect to answer all of these questions myself. And what I want to do is I want to get as many expert or insightful voices as possible to help me solve this problem. And I just think it's the piece of advice I would give is for organizations to try to, one, find their community, and then, do that outreach into that community, whether it's regulators, whether it's payers, whether it's health systems. I mean, I can't tell you at Medtronic how much we learned from health systems about value-based healthcare by simply aligning to their strategic imperatives and saying, look, we were focused on the same thing. We don't want to be compensated on volume. We want to be compensated on value. We want to be rewarded for improving patient outcomes or lowering cost. Like, getting that strategic alignment of imperatives, to me, is enormously important. And it just extends your reach, and it extends your ability to learn, and it extends your, you're right. The idea of introducing a medical device to treat a disease like Alzheimer's, the idea that we're going to ask patients to use this in their home an hour a day, right? Like, it does feel like a big ask, but I guess the thing that gives me comfort, allows me to go to sleep at night, is I don't feel like I'm the only person trying to answer that question. And I don't think Cognito's the only folks trying to answer that question. I think there's a big neurotech community that's trying to figure out ways to use physics and neurostimulation for different diseases. I think that there's a enormously supportive patient advocacy group in the Alzheimer's Association and Us versus Alzheimer's that are open to all sort of therapies coming forward. And I think government organizations like CMS and the FDA are eager and hungry to have new and novel solutions come to market that can solve these problems. I just think we need to solve them together, right? I just think we need to make sure that we're bringing them to them, not trying to do it in isolation.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I very much appreciate the feedback of engaging with the agency early, engaging with payers early, having the conversation and doing it as transparently as is, remotely feasible for the organization. There's obviously things you're always going to hold close to the vest, but being mindful of what you can and can't share and how much they can really be additive to helping you advance your strategy and leveraging that in a thoughtful way. One thing that makes me think about, Christian, is you've been incredibly proactive, I'd say, in engaging payers and working on the evidence base to tell your value story, especially given the uphill battle you have to climb here. Can you talk a little bit, kind of shifting to a different stakeholder that wasn't on your short list or your sixth list? How are you convincing Cognito's investors that doing this work now is so critical to the future direction and the strategy of the business?
It's a super interesting question, right? Because I feel like a company of this stage is kind of always raising money, right? And always talking to investors, and we're trying to, and right. And it's a place where, if I could figure out a place to kind of break the wheel, I would a little bit, which is, I feel like investors have traditionally we know market conditions right now are super challenging, right? Like that's just the world that we're living in right now. And, we have all kinds of, election events coming up and different things that we think might change, but it's a sensitive time right now in raising money. But I think unfortunately, like there are and understandably, I guess, I think investors sort of categorize their investments, right? So you look at something like Cognito and you say, well, is it really a traditional medical device, or does it have a therapeutic effect that's more akin to what we're seeing coming from the monoclonal antibodies? So do we talk to therapeutic investors? Well, then you think about the pathway, and you're going to go through CDRH, and you're going to go through, a durable medical equipment. So it's a medical device. So do you talk to medical device investors? And I think you have to shake. Yeah, what you have to find is folks that are looking to say, like, okay, what I'm not looking for is the traditional medical device, and I'm not looking for the traditional therapeutic. I'm looking for something that I think kind of sits in the middle of that. And in many ways, one of the ways, and I really, I applaud my predecessor, and I applaud Brent Vaughn, who's our CEO, and our board, which is, there's a thought in the market, which is the evidentiary burden for pharmaceuticals is in the pre-market, and the evidentiary burden for devices is in the post-market, which is why you see things like the Valley of Death and challenging of getting coverage for devices and digital therapeutics, because they can come to market, but then they don't have the sort of robust evidence portfolio. And I think what Cognito has done, and I think really, in a very wise way, is saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to raise money now to develop a evidence portfolio that is enormously agile. So when we need to talk to the scientific community, we're coming with, more than 500 patients across multiple clinical trial environments in a Medicare population to show. The same will be true when we talk to payers and CMS and when we talk to FDA. And so I think it's finding the right investor, right? And that takes a lot of time. I mean, I'm sure you've had many startup leaders on this, and you pitch a lot and you talk to a lot of people, and what you're trying to find the right archetype, right? And I think the way you find the right archetype is be very intellectually honest about what you are, right? I think if you can say with real clarity, this is what we are, what we're trying to do, then I think you can separate the wheat from the chaff there pretty quickly and say, like, okay, this is the right investor for me, this isn't. But I think the other piece is being very thoughtful about not just the challenges immediately in front of you, but how you're leveraging that investment to meet challenges down the line. And it's one of the places I will just tell you, I feel incredibly fortunate in that there are a lot of chief commercial officers of medical device companies that are going into the market and the clock is starting on, boy, we need to be revenue generative. And they're looking around saying, okay, who's going to pay for my device? How do I convince them? I don't have a whole lot of clinical evidence. How do I convince the physicians? And you know, when and if the FDA gives us the approval, I will be in a really advantaged position that I'll be able to say, okay, we've been very thoughtful about the evidence that we want to develop. We've been very thoughtful about understanding what the value proposition and the sort of questions we need to solve for. We've got this robust evidence portfolio. Let me bring that to market and solve the questions. And the hope and the bet is that that accelerates our ability to gain coverage and gain adoption. And so, yeah, I mean, I think sharing that and being really transparent about that with the investor community, because I think a lot of the investor communities think in stages, right? They think, okay, how do we get to the next gate? And I get it. I understand that's what, but I think to say we're going to leverage these investment dollars early to create tailwinds for ourselves that position us for when we get to those points to accelerate through them effectively and efficiently. I think it's been realized. I think it's set up. It makes for a challenging first couple of discussions, but I think I really do think that we're really well positioned when we get the opportunity to be in the post market, just because of the way how thoughtful we've been about evidence and the way that we've thought about answering, thinking about those stakeholders and the questions they might have.
I have to note, I've noticed multiple times you keep referring to the hope is that we can do X, and
Yeah.
your pivotal trial is called Hope.
Hope.
So
Right.
it all feels very apropos, right? It all pulls it together, which is pretty fantastic. I would definitely echo, though, the investor community is certainly also, the right time and place and focusing on the right things. And we're seeing a lot of investors focusing on, having therapeutic specific funds and other things that, they are looking for more innovative options, if you will, to treat some of these diseases. And so, there certainly is a lot of promise, and hopefully the right funding and support to test new modalities and new options coming to market for Alzheimer's and other disease states, where neuromodulation or other kinds of physical interventions might, result in a much better outcome for patients.
Yeah, I think I think it's going to be a fascinating next couple of years, right? And I really do mean that. I mean, I hope, for the sake of the patients, that Leqembi and donanemab and these disease modifying monoclonal antibodies come to market are enormously successful. I want to see these patients and these physicians has been desperate to give a therapy. But I think what it's going to do is, as in any new and emerging area of disease modification and Alzheimer's, what you're going to find is well, what are the challenges, right? What are the challenges around safety? What are the challenges around burden, right? We have a shortage of neurologists. We all know about the utilization challenges within health systems. So, are health systems able to meet the need, or is there a real desire to extend care into the home and think about reducing utilization within the health system? And so, we talk a lot about skating, the Gretzky skating to where the puck is, but I actually think where the puck is going rather than where it is. But I actually think there's no context of where the puck is, right? Because it's changing so dramatically right now. And I think, I think that it'll be really interesting for us as we come to market and as we think about, the particular patients, you'll hear from me all the time about appropriateness. Like, I want nothing more than to make sure our technology goes to the right patient at the right time in their disease progression, at the right point of care. And I think right now what we're going to find over the next couple of years is, as the monoclonals come and as other therapies come and as diagnostics explode, that's going to become much clearer for us. And that's great, right? Like that, I really do think, it's one of the reasons why I like this community perspective of Alzheimer's, because I think that those folks that are doing some of this pioneering work should be commended and rewarded. And I'm certainly going to, be watching and learning from that group as much as possible to understand what are the things that are most important to patients? What are the most important things that are most important to the caregivers? And what are the things that are most important to the physicians?
Absolutely. I definitely appreciate, Christian, you've been very clear on making sure that all stakeholders are seeing the value, that you're intellectually honest with how you're engaging with the community, and really, the core point of the discussion, which is having a strong evidence base that you can progress forward. But before we close up, are there any points of advice that you can give to other leaders moving into this space, those who might start to think about, their commercial journey and how they might start to generate some of this evidence to do what you're doing? What kind of advice would you offer those leaders?
The biggest piece of advice, it was a great piece of advice I got when I was in the Navy that I've tried to bring through my entire career, which is, if you put your team first, if you're transparent and trustworthy and really feel like you are, invested in what your team is doing, what it permits you to be is enormously accountable. And what I mean by that is admit to when mistakes are made, right? So it allows you this sort of latitude to take risks, to do small innovations, to, not think about taking the big swings, but let's do little micro innovations along the whole way and easily say like, oh, that didn't work. That's on me. I tried to do that. Here's why. Right. And I think what it permits is your team to sort of say like, great, right? Like he's transparent. He or she is transparent with me. They're trusting. I know they've put us forward. They've got a real North Star and the patients or whatever. And so I think far too often what I've seen is leaders they don't want to take accountability for making the decision, whether it is, if the decision goes well, then I think they take accountability, no problem. But if the decision doesn't go well, I think they're reticent to take because they're afraid that it's going to look poorly. And I think it's the one piece of advice I would give, which is be quick to take accountability. Like it's an empowering thing for your employees. I think your teams will then look at it and say like, oh, I want to be quick to take accountability. It permits me to be innovative. It permits me to do something that might be out of the bounds. Like I don't have to worry about the risk of blame because I live in a culture of like, yeah, I tried it, didn't work. I'm accountable for it. Let's move on. Let's go do the next thing. So I think it creates a really wonderful environment for people. And I think it creates an environment where innovation can really occur, which, there is no paint by number for any of this, right? There is no, great, let me open up the playbook and figure out how to take emerging piece of neurotech into Alzheimer's and figure out how I gain, 20% market share. Like that playbook doesn't exist. So you're going to have to build that playbook and you're going to have to create an environment that allows, when that play doesn't work, like, let's not run that again. Right. And the only way that environment is where people feel safe to sort of take the risk and say like, okay, great, didn't work. Let's move on to the next thing. So, that would be my one piece of advice to everyone is don't be afraid to raise your hand and say, oh, that was my fault, my bad, but this is why, and let's go on. Let's go do the next thing.
Absolutely. The agile mentality, fail fast, learn from your mistakes and progress as an organization and take that really innovative approach to everything you're doing. Very much appreciate that. Christian, this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much for joining the episode today. Good luck. Very much excited to see where Cognito goes and hopefully you can bring this product to market.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank your team and everything you guys are doing. It's really wonderful work and we love working alongside you guys. So
thanks, Christian.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.